Rusudan, thank you very much for joining this Trust Talks. I'm very glad to have you on the board, and I'm looking forward to listen to your thoughts of the crisis of trust from the perspective of securitization during COVID-19 pandemic. So let's start right away. How would you describe the situation in Georgia?
Thank you, Alina, for having me and giving me an opportunity to talk about securitization and changed threat perceptions in Georgia in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to speak from the position of Georgia because this is a country I originally come from and professionally keeping my eye on. When we talk about securitization, we versus them dichotomy comes to our attention. It's a never-ending discussion on the lines of different ideology and identity, and Georgia identifies itself as an European nation, and historically we have always recognized that development in Europe, the Black Sea region, the Caucasus, as well as in Central Asia and the Middle East are affecting our national security situation, and we have always placed the relations with our strategic partners, especially the ones in the West, to be of utmost importance, and especially when they're kind of tested during the crisis situations. So as a country facing conventional security threats ever since its independence in 90s, it's important to see the evolution of different security threats coming to the forefront of political and security agenda and then being desecuritized from time to time. So I'll be elaborating on these trends, but yeah, Georgia will be the primary focus and how it views its identity, strategic identity in relation to its partners as well as the enemies.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So do you think that COVID-19 pandemic somehow changed the processes of the perception of threat?
It is, we are 2 years into the pandemic already, and this is even cliche to say that COVID-19 has eroded the trust and the trustworthiness between people, and these crises have been manifested on individual, national, and international levels. And all these levels are greatly intertwined, and sometimes it's even hard to delineate their separate manifestations. But of course, the crisis built up on previously existing vulnerabilities within the societies and between the societies. And in the particular case of Georgia, the crisis of trust has been an integral part of political culture since 90s, unfortunately, and various governments have failed to resolve the crisis of trustworthiness, especially through their efforts of democratization. And as I mentioned, Georgia is facing this conventional security threats. Even though even pre-COVID times, we have witnessed increasing mechanisms employed through the hybrid or informational warfare that targeted Georgian society. But we saw that these efforts were even amplified in the COVID times, and they were even excavated due to the infodemic. So all these processes kind of came together. And if we look at Georgia security concepts in the past 20 years, let's say, we will see that conventional threats are on the forefront of our vision and our relations with our Western allies, especially the NATO, European Union, also bilateral partners such as the United States. And other security issues such as environment and health only usually took a paragraph, short paragraph dedicated in the security document. And they were there not mostly because health security issues have been more prevalent in some parts of the world, and from time to time they have gained international attention, and some traveling measures, restrictions have been imposed. But Georgia never really felt so close to these issues, and we can even say that even the recognition of environmental and health security issues were just a mere recognition of those issues being existed and being recognized by our Western partners. So when the pandemic started, of course, the health security became securitized, and there was even no question. It was just such a global phenomena. And in the beginning of the crisis, Georgian government introduced fairly strict measures, including the national lockdown. And quite soon, due to these strict measures, of course, the initial number of cases were quite low. And Georgia was so labeled as an international success story for effectively dealing with a crisis. But 1 year into the pandemic, and even earlier, the social and economic price of these strict measures became undeniably visible. And if we look at the public attitude data from this period, from early 2020, Georgian government had a higher trust from Georgian society and the recognition from international partners for effectively dealing with the crisis. But then when this economic fallout became more evident, of course, the public trust into institutions and the government eroded, and it led to further radicalization and polarization in the society. General uncertainty how to deal with the crisis and ever-changing circumstances worldwide, not having these clear-cut recipes from international organizations or even well-developed economic and political societies and countries, kind of affected Georgian society in a way that it was not the mere distrust towards institutions, but this general global confusion. How do we deal with this crisis? In the beginning, I would say the society was a bit naive to believe that conventional military threats would not take place, but there were also hopes that the pandemic would end kind of early. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and as we are going back to normal socially and economically, we also see that those conventional military threats or security threats are still prevalent. And we see this in Georgia and in our neighborhood. And this was especially visible in case of Nagorno-Karabakh, or very recently, and in Eastern Ukraine, where the military buildups Russian military buildups are increasing, as well as the use of pandemic is a justification for certain measures from de facto governments in Georgian breakaway regions, in Abkhazia and in Trimali region, and the complete ban of mobility between two regions, and taking health pandemic as a justification for relations with our breakaway regions. So we are now going back to normal, both in terms of our everyday actions, but also in terms of our understanding how the geopolitics work. And unfortunately, it's been visible that pandemic did not change the geopolitics. It only put it on hold for just a few months, and then maybe we came back to even more escalated situation if we are going back to normal.
As you mentioned, the lack of trust or little trust over the government is the part of Georgian political culture, which is Georgia is not, it's the case for almost all post-Soviet countries. But Georgia is also known, and you also mentioned in your speech that there is much trust and strive towards the European integration and partnership. So what are your thoughts about trust towards the international, European organizations particularly, and maybe overall Western international organizations?
The support for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration has remained quite high throughout the years. And I would not say that the pandemic had a major impact over this support. And if we look at the mask diplomacy, for example, in relations, again, during the pandemic with our Western partners, Georgia received the vaccine doses quite late into the pandemic. And of course, this led to the increased fear in the society as well. And then with support of our Western partners, we received some crisis recovery funds from the European Union, and the United States provided the first thousands of doses of Western vaccines to Georgia. However, I would not say that this efforts greatly transformed trust towards them or not, because those who favored relations with them remained in favor, and those who were suspicious of their efforts grew even more suspicious. However, in terms of these bilateral relations, maybe not much has changed. But as I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, Georgia has always recognized the effect of developments in Europe or in our close neighborhood. and kind of absence of Western institutions from negotiation peace talks during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and even now kind of inability to de-escalate the situation in Eastern Europe definitely put questions in Georgian society in the ability of these institutions to really assist the nations, partner nations in need to deal with such kind of crisis. And now it's not a question of the health crisis anymore, but a question of more military threats, because Georgia is very much in the same situation. So I would say some parts of Georgian society became a bit more skeptical due to these international events in our neighborhood of these institutions, but the support still remains high. But it just, we realize that we have to remain very vigilant, and we have to stand there for our partners internationally so that these issues do not go from the political agenda, because there are certainly some other economic and social priorities that fight for the place to be at the forefront of discussion. So for us, it's important to remain these topics on the agenda. And as international institutions are going back to face-to-face meetings, we see that more activity in this regard, but the global international relations are still at quite a complicated stage, and it's not so much due to the health crisis or anything. So for Georgia, it remains priority to integrate with NATO, with European Union, and to grow even stronger partnership with the United States. And we see military packages re-signed or extended to previous years. But then all of this comes with a conditionality, how we have our domestic politics and how we respect the democratic development and how we respect the human rights. And in this regard, there have been certain developments in Georgia that takes us back to the topics of Georgian public trusting the government and international society, reacting to Georgian government's actions in response to certain events. So this is a never-ending, not never-ending, but quite a complex topic where international and domestic politics kind of come to the nexus of how they're intertwined and are affecting each other.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like you're touching upon not only the attitude, public attitude about trust, but also about trustworthiness of the institutions. So I wonder, do you want to elaborate more about these two ideas?
So I just mentioned the development on the domestic front of Georgia. And even earlier, I mentioned the issue of radicalization and polarization within the society. So in summer of 2021, on July 5th, for instance, there was a major violence against LGBTQ and not only community in the capital of Georgia, and some far-right groups mobilized. I would say this event had a major effect of the trust of the crisis of trustworthiness towards the government and how they delivered, how institutions delivered. And we saw that government kind of enabled the discriminatory narrative, and the people who employed violence during this event are still not punished, or the proportionality of these measures against these groups have not been fair, some would say, from the government's side. And then we see that elections and other political processes are affecting this kind of dynamics. And of course, sometimes Georgian government has used this card that their measures kind of responded to the interest of majority of Georgia, while the interest of the so-called minority have been neglected. And this not only affected the crisis of trustworthiness of how Georgian governmental institutions deliver, but more on personal level as well. And this division and polarization between societies, and very strongly divided along with the ideological lines. And then we have another player, which is media, which has historically been polarized in Georgia on the party lines, and then increasing misinformation and disinformation in social media also affects this polarization. So we see the erosion of trustworthiness on various levels. But for most, this crisis of trustworthiness is most visible within the country. But our international priorities have remained the same, I would say, and they have not transformed to the great extent here. But we have received certain criticism from our international partners, and from time to time, it has certain pressure on governments, but not to not to the extent that it should work, unfortunately.
And it looks like, especially in our region, like in the Caucasus or the area of post-Soviet countries, however we identify ourselves, there are more risks of catastrophes or crises, and sometimes they are quite unexpected. So do you think that it should be considered like the normal turbulent life in our societies? And how are we dealing with that? How our policies should be changed, or what should we as a society learn, and how to deal with this?
You're absolutely right. We, no matter how we define the region, nowhere where we look north, south, west, or east, we all see we see the crisis emerging all around us, and it's been so for the previous centuries or so, because this has been a region of major geopolitical contestations. By now, we should have learned a lot from how to deal with the crisis. But unfortunately, when we create crisis management plans, that their flexibility is also very important, and how we adapt to new changing realities. In Georgia, or in the Black Sea region, or in Caucasus or post-Soviet states, it does not matter. We are used to staying vigilant, but in terms of broadening the understanding of catastrophes, I think now we do not have a luxury of eliminating the spheres where these catastrophes can happen. And here I would probably bring up the personal experience, because I studied international security, and my class was very international, and I had a lot of friends who came from Western countries. And when we were tasked to write a paper on the most pressing security issues of 21st century, some of them picked papers to write on energy security and on environmental security. While as a Georgian person, I felt responsible to still write about more conventional threats. And then we had this discussion, and I told them, I wish as a Georgian person, I had the luxury of prioritizing environmental issues and security threats over the conventional one. Yeah, I would not say the same sentence today, because maybe we did not predict the health crisis and health security threat of this kind, but this happened. But we also have another security issue, and different groups have been talking about it for years now, which is environment, but we have not seen a lot of actions delivered in this regard. So some threats happen completely unexpectedly. We have predicted the likelihood of others to be a bit higher, but we still do not take actions. And then here in our region, we are facing this military buildups, military issues, and hybrid threats coming together. So I would not want to live in the region where this is a normality, but the history shows and our presence shows that it remains to be the normal life for some, and it's time for us to kind of have a long-term agenda in place, but with the side of being also able to be flexible and to build institutions that will be able to adhere to democratic norms no matter what happens. So the human security should remain at the forefront of our understanding of security. I hope this is not a new normal, but for now it seems so.
Yeah, thank you very much, Russo. And I hope that we will manage to do that as countries and as societies, because we know that it is not very easy to balance between security and freedom or democracy. But yeah, I think that is one of our biggest challenges in our region. Thank you very much for your insights.
Sure, it was my pleasure. Maybe one last comment on
Sure.
the point you just made. In the beginning of the pandemic, there was this international debate of what kind of political regimes deal with best with the pandemic. And some have argued that undemocratic regimes were more successful, but we don't need an answer to this question. We should really remember that humans should be at the center of all the measures. So I really hope that humans become a priority in our region as well, and not the political interests or the electoral interests. So to end more on a positive note, I hope our region will also have a time when we believe that this is not a new normal, and we can also focus more on our well-being and more on human security.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, we need to work much. That is definitely the case. Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting, and yeah, and insights that we didn't have on this Trust Talks.